Dear Dinopati Jalal, a few days ago I saw your statement on Russia-Ukrainian crisis, and I would like to respond to you as a good friend, an experienced diplomat and a very intelligent and reasonable person. We have had many discussions about foreign policy of Russia and the promotion of Russian-Indonesian bilateral cooperation. So I feel it necessary, as your good friend, to explain from Russia's position what is happening now in Ukraine. You will agree with me that the situation around the world is becoming increasingly complex. It is deteriorating right in front of our eyes. This is because the United States and its allies persist with their aggressive efforts to impose the so-called rules-based order on other members of the international community. How has this order affected the world? Ukraine is a telling example. Let me emphasize that the root cause of this Ukrainian crisis is Ukraine's acts and its years-long sabotage of direct obligation under the Minsk package of agreements. A very short while ago, there still was hope that Kiev would think better and finally implement what it committed to back in 2015. What was needed? It was a direct dialogue with Donetsk and Lugansk in the first place. But then Ukraine's leadership once again confirmed that it was not ready for such a dialogue or steps towards granting a special status which was enshrined in the Minsk agreements to Donbass. Coupled with explicit support on the part of Ukraine's Western patrons, it finally convinced us that we had no right to let the people of Donbass suffer any longer. Neo-Nazis who seized power in Kiev following a government coup, supported by the West, unleashed terror on the country. The very recollection of the tragedy in Odessa on May 2, 2014 make me shiver. Do you know what happened then? Peaceful demonstrators were shot in a trade union building by Ukrainian neo-Nazis and burned alive. 38 people died. Not a single criminal was persecuted. The mass graves discovered in Donbass serve as evidence of the criminal consequences from the massive shelling of civilian infrastructure. Forensics experts identified most victims as women and elderly people. Our Western colleagues have been ignoring the multiple facts relating to this outrageous violation of the most basic of human rights, the rights to live. The attempt to draw attention to the violence and atrocities perpetrated over the past 8 years have been met with indifference. All these years, the Ukrainian regime has been carrying out an aggressive policy to get rid of everything Russian and promote forced assimilation. People who identify as Russian and would like to preserve their identity, language and culture are told in all clarity that they are not welcome in Ukraine. Vladimir Zelensky even referred to them as species or subhumans and suggested that they go back to Russia. He initiated a law on indigenous people where there was no place for Russians who have been living on these lands for centuries. Isn't that quite similar of the laws Nazi Germany used to have? The Russian language is being purged from schools and universities, from the public space and even from everyday life. Just imagine Ireland banning the English language, or Belgium the French language, or even Indonesia banning Javanese language. These large-scale systematic attacks on rights and freedoms, as well as the consistent effort to inculcate neo-Nazism, are being carried out with the consent of the United States, Canada and the EU, who arrogantly proclaim themselves exemplars of democracy. Ukrainian authorities, whom certain states have been arming and inciting lately, are still under a delusion that with the blessing of Western sponsors, they may secure a military solution to the problem of Donbass. Otherwise, it's hard to explain dramatic intensification of fire and acts of sabotage on the territory of the republics that I mentioned. But our Western colleagues preferred not noticing it and echoing Ukrainian telltales according to which the people of Donbass all but bombard themselves. When looking at this topic, we must be mindful of a broader context that triggered the current crisis in Ukraine. Back in 2008, at Russia-NATO summit in Bucharest, President Putin warned that NATO states should think twice or even thrice before making a boastful record that Ukraine and Georgia would be in NATO. But they presented it as a huge compromise that France and Germany could achieve, replacing the US proposal to extend the membership action plan to Ukraine and Georgia right away. For us, Ukrainians' accession to NATO is a red line. First of all, due to military and strategic consideration. Placement of NATO infrastructure in Ukrainian soil would make us retaliate, which would inevitably put Russia and NATO on the verge of conflict. That is why in December 2021, as you may know, we reached out to the US and NATO offering to make agreements that should give Russia some security guarantees. We extended our hand, but the US and NATO haughtily rejected us. Let me draw your attention to the fact that today we witness an information war on Russia in social media. Since there are no proofs that Russian military destroys civilian infrastructure, Ukrainian strikes and occasional hits are presented as such. We repeat again that Russia's special military operation does not seek to occupy Ukraine or inflict damage on the local population. Demilitarization of Ukraine, which is packed with NATO weapons, is aimed at protecting the long-suffering people of Donbass in Ukraine. The Russian special operation does not impact critical civil infrastructure. Again, Russian military pose no threat to Ukrainian peaceful citizens. They don't fire at peaceful facilities. What does pose a threat to the people of Ukraine are Ukrainian nationalists who in fact hold people as hostages and use them as human shield. There is numerous evidence proving that nationalists, despite people's protests, deploy heavy equipment and multiple rocket launchers in residential quarters. Today, no one wants to remember that the United States and its allies, which are directly responsible for numerous violations of human rights and international humanitarian law, are guilty of crimes that killed hundreds of thousands of people in Yugoslavia, Iraq, Libya and Afghanistan. Once again, apply double standards. The current Kiev regime is a vivid example of the fact that when you are a loyal vassal of the hegemon and participate with particular zeal in serving his policy of containing Russia, you can do anything you like. You can trample upon human rights and freedoms, kill people, and cultivate neo-Nazi traditions and practices. In exchange for your absolute obedience, the civilized West will turn a blind eye to everything. Moreover, the other day, the European Union, in a fit of Russophobic frenzy, decided to supply lethal weapons to Kiev. For us, the life of every Russian and Ukrainian, every resident of Donetsk and Lugansk is as valuable as the life of an European or an American. As President Vladimir Putin repeatedly stated, we have invariably been respectful of the Ukrainian people, their language and traditions. We have no intention of encroaching in any way on the interests of the citizens of Ukraine, with whom we are bound not only by common history as well as civilizational, spiritual and cultural affinity, but also by bonds of blood and kinship. Today, Russia is home to millions of people who were born in Ukraine. Together, we always have been and always will be so much stronger and more successful than apart. You said, stop the war, dear Padino. By our military operation in Ukraine, we're not launching a war. We're putting an end to it. Thank you.